Julian, thank you for those words. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for still being here. I know it's been an interesting but a long day, and I'm grateful for your presence. 11 weeks too soon. Our son James was due to have been born on the 31st of January of 2008. That was his due date. And instead, he came into this world on the 16th of November 2007. 11 weeks too soon. But those final 11, 12 weeks of pregnancy are absolutely essential, absolutely important in terms of preparing that child for life outside the womb. So when a child is born that prematurely, and in James's case, at just 29 weeks gestation, in fact, 25 minutes into that 29th week, when that happens, that child needs help to be able to breathe. His lungs aren't fully developed. His sucking instincts haven't matured yet, nor are they able to swallow by themselves. There's a chance of bleeding of the brain, something that usually happens on the second or third day after birth. There could be problems with eyesight and hearing. And of course, premature children very often take much longer to reach certain milestones in life, such as walking and so on. So these are all very real issues that preterm children need to contend with. Some, sadly, simply don't survive, and those who do very often are faced with difficulties that remain with them forever. So it's certainly not an easy start to life. I was a minister at the time. I remember having literally just sat down for an important work lunch, and I got a call from Genevieve, my wife. She said she was bleeding very heavily, and she was in hospital. In fact, she'd had some bleeding a couple of weeks earlier, but the nurse who saw her then dismissed it as being nothing to be particularly concerned about. I rushed to hospital. She was in the maternity ward. And at that stage, the aim was simply to try and delay labor as much as possible, because, of course, keeping the child in the womb, even by a few additional days, can really make all the difference. So Genevieve was given steroid shots so that the development of James's lungs could speed up. But come the next morning, I think it became very apparent to everyone that the baby was going to be born sooner rather than later. And there was a process of trying to find a space for Genevieve in a specialized hospital in Spain, which proved more difficult than envisaged. Finally, they did find a slot at the Hospital Materno Infantil in Malaga, which has a neonatal unit that specializes in premature births. And off we went, urgently. 2 ambulances, one for Genevieve, one for an incubator, because there was a real risk of the birth actually happening before we reached destination. I tried to, I was driving, my parents and my aunt were with me. I tried to keep as close to the ambulances as possible. It just wasn't to be. They were, running through red lights and so on. It was nighttime. It was dark. I had no idea where the hospital even was. Eventually, I found it. Eventually, I found my way inside and found Genevieve in what was the delivery room. And everything moved very quickly after that. There was no time for pain relief. I think there was no time even to assimilate what was happening. We were going through it. It was almost as if we were going through the motions. Yes, it was happening to us. We were there, but it's almost as if we were sort of viewing it from a distance. When the baby's head started to show, it was just Genevieve, myself, and the midwife. When the baby's head started to show, the midwife actually left the room. presumably to seek help. But the fact remains there was no one there to help deliver the baby. And for want of a better description, James literally fell out. He fell onto what was, an extension on the bed, slightly lower than the bed itself. And when, at that point, the rest of the staff came in, and when a mother has gone through all that pain of childbirth, what she wants is to be able to hold that child, and my wife wasn't able to. She wasn't able to hold him or touch him. I remember the midwife picked James up upside down from his feet. We saw him for 2 seconds, and he was whisked away. I was able to see him briefly that night, but it wasn't until the following day that we were able to see him together. James was to spend a total of 6 weeks in hospital, and it wasn't until day 11 that we were able to hold him for the first time. There was a routine of sorts. We rented a flat just 2 or 3 minutes away from the hospital. We'd visit several times a day, 6, 7, 8 times a day. Genevieve would feed him, initially via feeding tubes. I'd be there as much as I could, but on occasions I had to commute to Gibraltar for work. And if you can just picture the scene, this was a fairly large ward, maybe 3 or 4 interconnecting rooms, a total of maybe 30 or 40 incubators, each of them with a tiny baby inside, some of whom were fighting for their lives. They all had breathing and heart rate monitors, and those monitors, those machines would emit a low, continuous beep just to notify people that the machine was actually working properly. But when something wasn't going quite according to plan, when the baby perhaps had stopped breathing, or the heart rate had fallen, that machine would start to emit loud, much louder, continuous beeps. But it wasn't always apparent where the beeps were coming from. So there'd be moments of panic and confusion among all the parents trying to work out whether it's their child that was in trouble. Something similar also used to happen at visiting time. We'd often have to wait outside the ward. We wouldn't be allowed inside because there was an emergency inside, and there was that deep sense of unease about the parents waiting, not knowing whether your child was the subject of that emergency. So I think it's fair to say that we saw some things that we'd rather not have seen. One morning, we visited James. We were met by the doctor who told us that they'd carried out a scan of his brain, and there was, and I quote, something there. We were told it could be anything, and to basically to brace ourselves and to prepare for any eventuality, and that we'd have to wait 2 more weeks for a second scan just to show how things had developed. There were a lot of prayers said during those 2 weeks. They were very dark, difficult times. Prayers by ourselves, our parents and families, even, I know, prayer groups locally who had James in their thoughts. My approach through all of this, and Genevieve has always been far braver than I am in these things. I often tend to adopt the ostrich head in the sand approach. But it varied. There were days when I was very realistic about things, and I'd go through all the possible options of what could be happening, and how that may may affect James's lives and ours as a family. There were days when I was a lot more optimistic and positive, and everything's going to be okay. And there were many days and many moments when my approach was to block everything out because it was just too painful to bear thinking about. On the day when we thought that we were going to carry out that second scan, because we weren't exactly sure when it may happen, there was a session of Parliament that afternoon, which I had to attend. So I drove, my idea had been to drive early from Malaga to Gibraltar. As it happened, just as I left Malaga by the Plaza Mayor shopping center, the car broke down. I had to call a tow truck, and I remember sitting in the front seat with this tow truck driver, a lovely guy actually, a Peruvian guy who I was telling all about James, what had happened, what we'd been going through. And Genevieve called me, and she said they had carried out the second scan, and that whatever it was, whatever had been there, had somehow disappeared. I cried all the way down to Jib. I think it must have been the driver's most eventful journey of his career, and it was a huge weight lifted off all our shoulders. It was, I think, at that time that we first sort of saw the lights at the end of the tunnel. And there have been obstacles after that days, weeks, even years after that. But I think everything has seemed easy in comparison. During the first 2 or 3 years of his life, James was hospitalized on a few occasions with breathing difficulties, suffering from croup and bronchiolitis and so on. And still, sometimes he attends physio sessions just to be sure that his motor skills continue to develop as they should. But as you can see, and he's down there on the second row, he's a very healthy, very bright 8-year-old boy. He supports Liverpool, and he likes Marillion, so we're doing very well. On a serious note, I think not a moment goes by when we don't realize just how fortunate we are at how things have turned out. And we know things could have been very different indeed, and our hearts really do go out to those parents whose premature children sadly didn't make it, or those parents whose children do have serious difficulties that are the legacy of having been born prematurely. And I would take this opportunity, if I may, to urge future parents, and it's Valentine's weekend, there's bound to be future parents before the end of the year, to remain vigilant, and at least contemplate the possibility of a premature birth, because it happens far more common than we may otherwise think. Thank goodness there are some great medical professionals out there, and groups like Baby Steps locally, who Genevieve is a member of, who are there to support and provide guidance and advice to those families who need it. I'm about to expire my time, just 2 more minutes. When I was a very young boy, my grandmother, Dolores, my father's mum, she told me something in passing, but which has stuck with me ever since. She explained to me that when her husband, my grandfather, who I never met because he passed away when my dad was just 9 years old, he was in the hospital lying on the hospital bed. Something happened, I'm not sure exactly but there was a need to lift him off the bed urgently. My grandmother, who was actually a very petite lady, she told me how she didn't know, she had no idea where the strength came from, but she managed to lift him up. She did what had to be done. And I sort of draw an analogy between that and what we went through. In her case, it was physical strength. In ours, emotional. But, you know, sometimes there's no time to stop. There's no time to think. You just do what needs to be done. And if I had been told in advance, you know, your son is going to be born 11 weeks early, he's going to spend 6 weeks in Malaga in hospital there, there'll be obstacles to be overcome along the way. You know, my reaction would probably have been to put my hands to my head and said, no, we can't deal with this. We're not going to be able to cope. But cope, we did. And if this experience has taught me one thing, is that we as human beings, and particularly I think as parents, we're able to adapt. We're able to very quickly deal with whatever life throws at us. Often life-changing circumstances, but we're there and we deal with it. So I hope I leave you, and I hope you regard this story as one of hope and a positive one. And you know, in fact, the other day as I was preparing, you know, what to say this afternoon, a thought came to my head. You know, I look back now, and yes, there have been some very hard, very dark, very difficult moments for us, but you know, there's no point in having regrets. That serves no purpose. It helps no one. The fact is, we've been blessed with 2 wonderful children, James and Sophie. Yes, like I say, dark moments, but those experiences helped shape us. They shaped us as parents, they shaped our families, and they certainly shaped James and made him into the boy he is today. So, you know, now that I think of it, perhaps James was not born 11 weeks too soon after all. Maybe he was born at just the right time. Thank you.